皆さんこんにちは。司会を務
Good
めさせてい
afternoon,
ただき
ladies
ま
and
す
gentlemen.
国際文化会館常務理事で API プレジデン
I'm
トを拝
Managing
命いたしました
Director
ジンボでございます。
of IHJ and President of API. My name is
さんからの基調講
Jimbo.
演を受けて
Having listened
こ
to
れから
the
2つの
keynote
セッ
address
シ
by
ョン
Mr.
に
Robert
分けて
Ward,
ですね
we'll have
具
two
体的なテ
sessions
ーマを論じていきたいと思い
to
ます。
discuss
でこ
on
のセ
two
ッション
separate
1は
topics.
サプライチ
Session
ェ
1
ーンの
will
強靭
cover
化という
supply
テーマ
chain
を
resilience.
扱ってまいります。先ほど司会から
As
紹
was
介がありまし
introduced
た
by
通り
the MC, we
3
have
人の素晴
three
らしいパネリスト
distinguished
をお迎えして議
panelists
論を深
in
め
this
ていきた
session
いと思いま
to
す。
deepen our
私の
discussion.
左
To
か
my
ら
left,
駐日英国
from the
大使
British
館
Embassy
経済金
in
融参事官の
Japan,
ナオミ・デイビ
Counsellor
スさんです。
Economic
よ
and
ろしくお願い
Finance,
します。
Ms. Naomi Davies.
でそ
Next
してそ
to
の
her
左が
is
株式
from
会社フロンテオ代表取締役社長の
the
森本
CEO,
正弘さんです。よろしく
Mr.
お願いいたし
Masahiro
ます。
Morimoto.
で最後一番左ですけれども、
To my
地
far
経学
left,
研究所主任研究
Senior
員の
Research
相
Fellow
良さん
of
です。
the
よろしくお願いい
Institute
たし
of
ます。
Geoeconomics, Mr. Sagara.
このサプライチェーン
Now,
の強靭化
supply
という
chain
テーマ
resilience,
を少し掘り下げて
let
考
us
え
think
ていきた
about
い
this
というふうに思います。
in more detail.
経済安全保障を推進する
In
にあたって、
promoting
サ
economic
プライチェー
security,
ンが健全であ
supply
ると
chain
いう
being
ことは
sound
決定
is
的に重要だという
decisively
ふう
and
に考え
critically
て
important.
おります。で、こうグローバル経済の
In
中
the
での
global
企業の
economy
視点
from the
から
perspective
考
of
えていきます
businesses,
と、いかにこのグローバル市場を使い
how
こな
are
して
we able
生
to
産
make
拠
use of the
点
global
とそし
markets
てこの調
to
達
have
先というものを
production
オプティマムな形でこう
facilities
組み上げてですね、でそこにこの
and
付加
supply
価値
chains in a
を
optimal
向上させ
fashion
て
to enhance
クオリティの高い
value
プロダク
add
トとサービスを生み
to
出していく。
produce
これは
high
まさに
quality
グローバル
products
経営
and
の革
services.
新的な要
This
素
is
と
the
いうふうに思
essence
いますし、そこにこのそれぞれの経営者の
and
手腕
the
が
skills
問われているというの
of
が、
each business
これが
manager
グローバ
will
リズ
be
ム時
required to
代
do
にお
this.
ける
So
グ
in
ローバル
the
サプライチェーン
globalism
の考え
days,
方で
this
あっ
was
た
the
という
way
ふ
to
う
think
に
about global
思いま
supply
す。
chains.
と
But
ころが今
today,
我々が見ている
as we
世
look
界
around the
は
world,
ロシアのウクライ
there
ナ
was the Russian
侵攻
invasion of
で
Ukraine,
エネルギーおよ
and
びさまざ
energy
まなこの
and
化
various
石燃
fossil
料の
fuels
サプラ
supply
イチェーンというもの
chains
が
have been
ディスラプトされ
disrupted.
てしまったり、アジアを
Looking
見
at
まして
Asia,
も例えばミャ
there
ンマ
was
ー
the
のク
coup
ーデターが
d'etat
起
in
こると、
Myanmar.
せっかくいろんな形
So
で戦略
several
者
hundred
進出して
companies
新し
have
い形で
invested
のこの市
in
場の開
Myanmar
拓という
to
もの
try
を
to
目指して
create
いた
new
ことが
markets,
や
but
はり大きな
that
影
was
響を受けてしまうと。
given a
でさら
setback.
に隣の中国
Looking
を
at
見ましても、当
China,
然米
obviously
中
there's
の
the
対
US-China
立の中で、例えば投資規制と
confrontation.
か
There are
輸出管理とか
restrictions
キリギリス
on
の移転と
investment,
か、そういったも
export
う難
controls,
しい
and
問
controls
題を
of sensitive
企業自身
technology.
が判
These
断して、
difficult
そして
issues
政
will be
府と協
handled
力しながら
by
考え
businesses
ていかな
working
ければいけな
together
い
with the
とともに、
government.
例えばウイグ
And
ル
at the
の
same
と
time,
か
there is
新
the
疆の人権
Uyghur
問題
and
など、
Xinjiang
新
human
しいこ
rights
の人
issues.
権ファク
So
タ
the human
ーさえ
rights
も
is
が
also
サプライ
becoming a
チェーンを考え
factor
る時
in
の
thinking
重要
about
な
supply
問題となって
chains.
きているということだと思います。今のがいわゆるこの地
So
政
these
学
are
的な人為的な問題ということでもあるんですけれども、
artificial
実は
issues,
この2年間我
man-made
々は
issues.
パンデミックという
But over the past 2 years, we were faced with the
自
pandemic.
然災害
This
に
is
類する
comparable
よ
to
う
a
な
natural disaster.
新しい形でのサ
We
プラ
are
イチェーンの寸
seeing
断ということも経験
disruptions
した
of the
わ
supply
け
chain
で
in a
います。
very new
そうした
way.
ことを考えると、安
So
全で
safe
グロー
and
バル化というもの
globalized
がどちらかというとその国境を越え
borderless
て活動す
activities.
るこのグローバルな経済の下で組み上げられ
The
てき
kind
た
of
サ
supply
プ
chains
ラ
that
イ
was
チェーンの
developed
最適化と
in
は
such a globalized
異なる
world.
なんかこうサプ
We
ライ
need
チェー
to
ン最
try
適化の
to
定義みたいなも
define
のが
optimization
今
of
必要
supply
とされ
chain
てい
in
る
a
んじゃないか
different
というこ
way
とを含め
in
て
this new
この
environment.
サプライチェーンの強靭化
So
という
when we
問
take
題
up
を
the issue
考
of
えてい
supply
きたい
chain
と
resilience,
いうふうに
these are the
思っていま
perspectives
す。
that we would
で
be
今日お
looking
招
at.
きした皆さん、
Now the
実はその国も違うし、
panelists today,
産
they
業
are
セ
from
クター
different
という点にお
countries
いて
and
も、おそ
also
らく
they're
こうい
different
ろんな
in
形
industrial
でサプライ
sectors.
チェーンの考え方がそれぞれ異
I'm
な
sure
るんだ
that
という
the
ふうに
views on
思い
supply
ます。
chains
そういう異
may
なる
be
立場にお
different.
けるサプライチェーンの強
So
靭
from
化という
those
もの
different
を対象させて
perspectives,
どういう
and
ふう
when
に
we
考え
think
てい
about
けばいいの
supply
かという
chain
ことを
resilience,
まず
how should we contrast these different perspectives? We would like to hear comments from Ms. Naomi Davis first, and I would like to pose the same questions to all of the panelists first. Supply chain resilience. For supply chain resilience, what are the main factors? What do you think are the main factors for supply chain resilience? And there are many disruptions to supply chains. Supply chains face various crises, but in order to overcome those crises, what would you say is important?
Jimbo-san, arigatou gozaimasu.
I am now studying Japanese, but I have seen just a little bit of progress on economy. Economic security is a very difficult issue, so I would like to switch to English language.
Jimbo-san has mentioned the 3 key topics that he's asked us to address in our opening remarks today, and I want to say thank you for bringing the British Embassy here, inviting us to share our perspective. So I won't repeat them because you've just heard them, but I will start by looking at improving supply chain resilience. So as you all know, as Robert Ward mentioned earlier, supply chain risks and building resilience have been a salient global issue for some time. They've really come to the top of the agenda since the start of the pandemic, and were recently further exacerbated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There were many acute challenges in the early days, which put extreme pressure on the global goods supply chains and our collective infrastructure. Although, having said this, the supply chains were largely able to withstand the shocks through targeted intervention. This has reminded all nations of the importance of being able to secure the products critical to us, and emphasised the importance of an effective international rules-based trading system where everyone plays their part and the free flow of trade is maintained. In the wake of the pandemic, the UK government set up the Global Supply Chains Directorate within the Department for International Trade. So over the course of the last 2 years, it's built up the UK's capability to collate data flows and analysis, and provide insight and achieve an active monitoring of critical supply chain vulnerabilities and mitigation plans enabling data-driven decision-making. The UK government's starting point when building resilience is to take a market-first, actor-agnostic approach. We firmly believe that resilience comes through diversity of supply rather than through pure self-reliance. We all prosper from an open economy, and openness itself can confer resilience. Where disruptions would have a negative impact on public, national, or economic security, and intervention is required to minimise exposure of critical supplies, the UK government is able to take quick and decisive action. To do this, we've developed a framework to guide the actions that we can take to build resilience. Our market-first approach is enshrined in our strategic framework, which is made up of 4 pillars that can be used in a combination that require the least intervention to achieve the necessary increase in resilience. So the 4 pillars are diversifying supply through trade and global sourcing. Secondly, partnering with close allies and collaboration with international partners. The 3rd pillar is creating strategic reserves of critical goods and in the supporting infrastructure. And the 4th pillar is, where appropriate, to expand UK production. Businesses, of course, play a critical role, however big or small they are. Having an accurate picture of the various levels of their supply chains and the associated shocks that could put key operations from production to shipping at risk. That's why the UK government has recently published guidance that will provide organisations with tools to gain greater understanding of their supply chains and manage risks and future shocks. If you haven't already seen this and would like to know more, please come and speak to me afterwards. So, secondly, the second question on diversification and decoupling, and I promise this will be a little bit shorter. So, the UK government firmly promotes a global outlook, as resilience, as I've mentioned, is achieved not by pivoting away from any one country or region, but rather by tapping into a more diverse range of sources. So I think you can tell that we're very much in the diversification camp. The role of government is to ensure that the market functions are protected for the long term from geopolitical distortions, and we continue to champion an effective and efficient market with like-minded partners such as Japan and the wider Indo-Pacific region. China is an important trading partner for the UK. Our bilateral trade was worth £94 billion in 2021. And throughout the pandemic, China did prove to be a fairly reliable trading partner, generally avoiding imposing export restrictions and continuing to export critical medical supplies to the UK and across the globe. Disconnecting China from the UK economy would be counterproductive to our aim for a positive, constructive relationship, as was set out in the integrated review that we published in 2021. So what we do, or what we set out in the integrated review, is that we seek to explore ways to strengthen our trade and investment partnership with China as well as with the wider region. However, and there is quite a strong however, we must make sure to avoid strategic dependency and that there is no violation of property rights or forced technology transfer. I realise that I am going on a little, so I will not mention Russia now, but there's always an option for that in Q&A. So, the final point I think that we were asked about was sort of further opportunities to build up ties between Japan and the UK and wider Asia. So Japan and the UK have much in common, with similar approaches to global trading principles and international cooperation. Japan's upcoming G7 presidency presents a tangible moment for the UK and Japan to continue to promote our aligned interests on the global stage and will play a leading role in achieving wider objectives of both Japan and the UK in the Indo-Pacific region. It's also very important for the UK to build closer relationships with our partners in other parts of Asia too, which many of you may have seen if you've read the integrated review that I just mentioned. The UK government values the different perspectives and opportunities to work together with a variety of international partners. And I'll just sort of quickly mention some of our recent efforts. So one is a joint capability building initiative with Australia, which we announced earlier this year to help other nations' governments develop resilience in their supply chains. Another area is in 2021, we signed an enhanced trade partnership with India, and we are looking to negotiate a free trade agreement with the world's biggest democracy this year. And of course, as Dr. Ward mentioned earlier, CPTPP. So we have a strategic dialogue partnership with ASEAN, and the UK is looking and I think actively negotiating to become part of CPTPP at the moment. I think I've almost certainly run out of time or run over time, so I'll leave that there and look forward to questions later. Thank you.
はい、デイビスさん時間ありがとうございました。
話を聞いていると、Miss Davis, having listened to you for the initial symposium of the Institute of Geoeconomics, the theme is Japan and Japanese and British perspectives. I believe that this was a very good choice we made. And as Miss Davis said, Japan and the UK, we do have many things in common. Both are global financial centers, and the industries do produce high value added, and they require high value added supply chains. And maritime nations, logistics are very important. So by Japan and UK joining together, there are very deep areas where the two countries can cooperate. Now, next, I would like to turn to Mr. Morimoto. FRONTEO provides AI solutions. And recently, supply chains, AI analysis is an area where FRONTEO has been focusing a lot of effort into. So I look forward to Mr. Morimoto's presentation. Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Morimoto from FRONTEO. using high-tech open source intelligence system would be used so that economic security related strategy could be developed together with this technology. In order to develop technology, you need to have an awareness of the current status. What you need to know is the supply chain and also shareholder networks. Inside the supply chain, these businesses and companies, who are controlling these companies? You first need to understand that. And researchers' networks, important critical technologies distribution are conducted amongst researchers. So you need to know this. But it's not simple. On the screen, to the left, this is the supply chain network of a semiconductor manufacturing company. There is 100,000 nodes, and there's a choke point in the middle. This is a Chinese-related defense company. This is the fifth level destination from the manufacturing industry. And on the right-hand side here is the shareholder network of an infrastructure company. It is almost looking like a galaxy. And here is the Chinese government represented in this red dot. So even if they are so distant, they have almost 100% effective control over the company, the target company. Understand this complex network. It's not possible for a human being to have this understanding. So that is why we have AI-enabled high technology analysis system was developed by us. We call it Seizu analysis. So I would like to give a demonstration with video, taking the example of Tesla in analyzing the supply chain. I wonder if I can speak to this video as quickly enough. Now, let me input the name of the company, Tesla. And the system is showing the supply chain. And the size of the circle is the number of layers of the company. And to the left, at the far left is Tesla. And to the right, here's the first order, second order, and the third order supply chains. And we're going to be scrolling down. And we go through the filtering process. For example, you give the name of the company, and the layer of the supply chain, and by country, and by industry as well. And there's also the sanction list, as well as ESG issue lists, including human rights violation. And this time, semiconductor industry-related businesses will be filtered down in this supply chain. And entity list would also be used for this filtering process. And then SMIC would come up. SMIC and their relationship with Tesla would be shown in this way. And once you decide that SMIC is a risk, then alternative supplier would have to be searched. So AI says UMC could be an alternative. This is not TSMC. That's the decision of the AI. This company should not be a problem, but for example, we want to check whether the Chinese government doesn't have control over the company. So we do have the shareholder network analytics. So let's take a look at this UMC, and there is 0% control from the Chinese government. In addition, what's shown here is the network of researchers with respect to autonomous driving. So Tesla-related literature would be analyzed. And about 11 companies would be shown. And let's use the US sanction list to do further filtering. Then we will see that through UC Berkeley, with Beijing Institute of Technology, Tesla has a collaboration relationship. This we have found out through this analysis. So even Tesla, a company like Tesla, they have connections which can be conceived as risky, but just looking at this, we cannot conclude that there is risk. We need to be looking closer to the content. But the network in the world is not so easily understandable as we can see from this. So our recommendation is that humans, the world looked at by humans, there are limits to what we can observe. So we may end up having the wrong understanding, and there are many things that we cannot find out just by human beings. So we need to use high technology, making use of open source intelligence to try to widen our understanding of the world. In our view, I think this is an ability should be held by the government to try to build more resilient supply chains. The governments should be taking the lead. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Morimoto. This was truly an eye-opening analysis on supply chain. You have given us a very good example. So as supply chain seems to be so complex and networked from primary to the seventh or the eighth layer of suppliers, and you have such a highly complicated relationship and networks, it is very, very hard for us to understand where lies the risks and where lies the choke points. So the human beings cannot really understand fully. So artificial intelligence seems to have applied for these areas, which is something very good and advisable. I would like to ask you questions later. Now, this will be the last commentator for the first round. For the past few years, because of the COVID pandemic, and from different perspectives, you have been watching and analyzing the whole of the world from the point of view of the health security. As Mr. Robert Ward mentioned about pandemic as a second, the risks to be involved, and trying to enhance resilience of supply chain. And this is also closely related to the issue of the health security. So, Mr. Sagara, would you like to speak now? Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I am a senior researcher at the Institute of Geoeconomics. On economic security and health security, these are the two areas of security that I am involved as a researcher. Now, economic security as related to the health sector was clearly being brought forth by the COVID-19 pandemic. The supply chain is directly connected to the life and health of the citizens. The personal protective equipment, including face masks and medical gowns, it has been very difficult to try to procure enough volume and quantity of the PPEs. There have been export regulations in European Union on vaccines, so Japan was lagging behind when it came to importing of vaccines. And in the economic security, the policy that the Kishida administration is pursuing, the new law has been established in order to have the ample procurement of such supplies. What is to be deemed as critical technology and critical materials and products? First of all, to identify those critical materials and products. And every ministry and agency would try to determine those critical areas of the products. And I'm sure all of you who may know better than me, the supply chain seems to be highly complex these days. So when we try to enhance the resilience, it is something very difficult to do. With the Boston Consulting Group, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry is looking at the global supply chain and making a study. The product life cycle is getting shorter and shorter, and human rights as well as green issues and climate change also need to be considered. And pandemic is also related to the natural disaster as well as the US-China competition and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The geopolitical risks seem to be expanded and becoming even more difficult. And the supply chain is becoming highly complicated. What we should do in trying to achieve resilience for the supply chain for Japan. First and foremost, we need to have targeting of critical products and technology. For targeting, United States and European Union have already gone ahead. In the United States, in February of 2021, White House have put forth an executive order for semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, rare earth, and the batteries of electric vehicles. A review of what's to be made, as you may know already. And within 100 days, the report was to be issued. And report, I'm sure, is well known to many of you. What is not being focused upon in Japan, on the 24th of February this year, 1 year after the executive order has been issued, White House have come up with comprehensive policy on reinforcing the supply chain, energy, food, transport, public health, ICT, and defense. For these 6 sectors, and every department have come up with strategy to reinforce the supply chain. And that was on the day of 24th of February, the very day when Russia has invaded Ukraine. So it was not really widely reported inside Japan, but when you look at these reports and announcements in detail, it is quite interesting. Where lies the vulnerability? That is the same vulnerability for United States. It's being reviewed, and it's, for example, for pharmaceuticals. So based upon the report that I have just referred to, in May this year, essential medicines list has been announced by the FDA in the United States. So these are the developments we have seen in the United States as well as Europe. Now, what about Japan? Even though we do deem pharmaceuticals and semiconductors are quite important, the targeting should be different from US or the European Union. For those essential medicines, from 2019, Ministry of Health, Labor and the Welfare have tried to create a list for the medical supplies which need to be stably procured, especially for the antibiotics. The effective ingredient have been produced in China and Italy. There has been some problems to do with the quality of those ingredients. So globally, the supply may be cut off. And that was a concern back in 2019. And the Ministry of the Health has been working closely with the industry associations as well as experts to try to come up with systematic targeting, which is not widely known. The businesses would come up with advice for what is to be highly risky and dangerous. And such good practices must be expanded, not just for products, but also you need to have targeting for technologies as well. Secondly, we need to have a whole-of-nation collaboration between the government and the private sector. For economic security, it is often the case that the government would coerce the businesses to do something very hard to do. And for companies, there will be a heavy burden placed on them. So zero-sum game was the norm, but we need to avoid this for pharmaceuticals because medicines will protect the life and health of our people. And the supply chain, more resilient, will be able to save the lives of our people. And that should be bolstered. And for the businesses, there is a possibility to have enormous benefits to be provided. That possibility has been indicated. For example, more recently, Pfizer's messenger RNA vaccines was the best-selling pharmaceutical in 2021. The sales turnover would be perhaps above 4 trillion yen. We do not know how much profit that they have been able to gain. But Big Pharma used to be criticized very strongly. But the brand image has not been damaged at all this time for the vaccines. They have become the saviors and the leaders of the different governments. The network has been enhanced, and for the R&D to come in the future, the Pfizer was able to garner the necessary funding as well as the good experience. For COVID and influenza, Pfizer is now trying to develop vaccine which would be effective for both. So in the supply chain, what Japan should do is for end-to-end basis, supply chain needs to be visualized and made visible. And from vaccines, starting from the raw materials and ingredients, and we should work with the United States and the United Kingdom, working with like-minded countries and allies to try to cooperate with each other. That is what is needed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sagara, for a very comprehensive analysis of the supply chains covering pharmaceuticals, the area of health. What is the risk? You gave a very detailed discussion on that. So from here on, I would like to ask each of you questions one by one.
Now,
Mr. Morimoto, if I could ask you a question. As I understood it, with the artificial intelligence analysis, with the Seizu analysis, that you are able to make a very in-depth analysis and specific the risks that could be identified, and for businesses, alternative solutions could be suggested. And in offering such solutions, you will be able to also apply artificial intelligence. I can imagine that. So, whatever solution mechanism could be used, perhaps there are many cases where you cannot really find any substitutes because substitution is too costly, perhaps, or for specific ingredients or materials or components, there are no substitutes in certain cases. So with artificial intelligence analysis, you may not be always led to possible solutions. Does that happen? And as you go into the secondary or tertiary, and if you delve further, to what extent do you need to be concerned for your transaction and supply chain? Artificial intelligence is not perfect, if I may say so. So the facts are within the scope of what we know. So there are things we cannot do. Yes, that is true. In some cases, we need to seek new solutions with wisdom, which goes beyond even the power of artificial intelligence. Now, in any case, for supply chain, we need to have a good grasp of the supply chain. Supply chains in many components and segments are not visible. So if you go from the primary to the secondary to the tertiary levels, to how many levels do you need to watch and have control over? That is not really relevant. Coverage must be expanded and try to, as quickly as possible, find the problems. And that is the reason why I'm using technology, open source intelligence, using artificial intelligence. And using such technology and watch the whole world And as was mentioned earlier, the world does not have any clear decoupling yet. It is not that clear cut. For certain products or for certain technologies or for certain issues like environment, countries will collaborate and cooperate, but sometimes they do compete and have decoupling with each other. So it is a mixed situation. Very smart moves are being made, perhaps, if I may say so. Especially for Japan. And UK, I'm sure, is far ahead of us. So especially for Japan, what we need to do is to enhance our capability using technology to have the right strategy be put in place. And particularly for this area, government needs to place more importance and emphasis. For supply chain, when businesses are to do something, they would always go for something cheap. And if that is something suitable, then that's fine. But if it leads to some unfair labor practices, or if the certain the rogue states are involved in certain areas and businesses unknowingly go into such areas, that would not do. In our own system, in a supply chain, choke points are made clear. Whether the choke points are resilient enough or not, you should also bring in the perspective of security, not just economics. So in that sense, the intelligence function as a very basis needs to be there.
Thank you. And the last question is for Mr. Sagara. Pharmaceuticals supply chains. With this pandemic, and the risks need to be re-evaluated. When we do so, what it appears to be a problem is API, active pharmaceutical ingredients. There is dependence on China, a very conspicuous dependence on China, whether you're procuring drugs or thinking of new formulations. If you depend on a certain country too much, this is going to be a very important point in thinking about pharmaceutical supply chains. And that is exactly why President Biden included pharmaceuticals in 4 areas of supply chains. Now, Mr. Sagara, what do you think about this problem? How do you think policies should be developed in this area? And when you think about risks, as we heard from Mr. Ward, China may weaponize this interdependence, and even pharmaceuticals could be used as part of their weaponization strategy in the future. We need to be thinking about supply chain resilience with that in mind. What do you think? Thank you for the question. As you said, for pharmaceuticals, there are raw materials or APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients. For APIs, China and India, there is quite a bit of a dependence on these 2 countries. That's already clear, be it procurement cost and other issues included. And the pharmaceutical industry's supply chains have already become globalized and very complex. So even if you stop one line, the impact may not be so huge, but we shouldn't be too optimistic. If you gather public information and end-to-end supply chain to identify where vulnerabilities are, it is possible that China already understands this. So we should be prepared for any eventualities. But in the pharmaceuticals industry, API and raw materials issues have become well known. But on the topic of vaccines, a totally different landscape can be seen. Japan, with technical cooperation, UK, Oxford, AstraZeneca, and Novavax vaccines are currently produced domestically in Japan. So when we listen to the people in the pharmaceuticals industry, they say that, were there any problems with China? And they say that they cannot think of one. And what they say is that there is no longer filters. Filters are produced in the United States. So filtering vaccines, filters, there was huge competition over filters. And there are two reasons why. One is that the US itself, they had this Operation Warp Speed to accelerate production of vaccines, ring fencing parts and raw materials for vaccines. And on a global scale, not just in Japan, but in Europe, for production of these vaccines, there was this ring fencing of parts and raw materials. So even amongst allies and like-minded countries, when it comes to economic security, there needed to be consultation. It's not just coordinating on pharmaceuticals and semiconductors. Even in Japan-US alliance management, we need to discuss which item is going to be taken care of by which country. And the White House, if they want to develop certain technology, some of that is the technology that Japan is strong in. What does this mean? Is the US intent on developing those technologies on their own, or are they willing to work with Japan because Japan has an edge? We need to be looking at each one of these items. So other than API and raw materials from China, we need to be looking at these details in having these discussions.
Thank you. As I listen to the comments made by the panelists, the structure of the market, it seems to be moving towards going beyond how to build the optimum structure, but how to enhance trust and confidence amongst the partners. So trust seems to be the key factor here. Now today, we had Councillor Davis as well as Mr. Morimoto and Mr. Sagara shared with us from different countries' point of view and different areas of interests, but in order to bring resilience for the supply chain, there were many things which were in consent and in agreement. And as we introduce many different perspectives, we will be able to shed light further on our analysis, and that is, I believe, the role to be played by our institute. So today, this is just a starting point so that we can further deepen our understanding for all these issues. I would like to thank the three panelists for very insightful reviews. Thank you. A big applause for them, please.